For most people, the dream is simply to stand on top of Mount Everest, to take that final step to the summit, snap the photo and say, I was there. But for some, the dream doesn't end at the summit. For them, it begins there. Marco Siffredi was only 22 years old when he became the first person to snowboard down Everest. But for Marco, that was just the beginning. A year later, he returned to chase an even bigger dream, a line so steep, so dangerous, that even the boldest climbers had barely dared to enter it, the Hornbein Couloir on the north face. He made the summit. Witnesses saw his first turns down the face, and then he was gone. Marco Siffredi vanished into Everest, never to be seen again. To understand Marco Siffredi's story, you have to go back to Chamonix, France, the birthplace of extreme mountaineering and skiing. I have a video about Mont Blanc in Chamonix, France that I'll put a link in the description for that you have to see when this video is over. Marco didn't even start snowboarding until he was 16 years old, but at age 17, he'd already accomplished some of the most dramatic descents in the entire Chamonix Valley, including riding the north face of the Aiguille du Midi, one of the Alps' most treacherous lines. In a few short years, Marco had ticked off nearly every legendary descent in the area. On the surface, he looked kind of like a punk rocker. Dyed hair, piercings, and a gap-toothed smile. To outsiders, he seemed brash, reckless, even cocky. But to those who knew him, they described something completely different. Kind, respectful, almost innocent. And he took his descents extremely seriously. A young man with a childlike joy for life who just happened to chase it down the steepest, most dramatic lines on the planet.
T'as pas le droit à l'erreur, c'est ça qui est marrant. T'es vachement concentré et tout, après c'est un délire qui est marrant, c'est bizarre quoi.
In an interview captured with Marco, he said that extreme riding for me is like skiing. It starts the moment you no longer have the right to make a mistake. You're just thinking about making it to the bottom alive. Every single turn you take has a price. He said, no room for error. He went on to say that's what's fun about it. You're totally focused, and then it's kind of delirium. It's fun. It's strange. If you don't want to take risks, you shouldn't go into the mountains because no matter what, you're always playing a little game with fate. He understood the stakes, and yet he kept chasing them anyway. In 2001, at just 22 years old, Marco accomplished something nobody in the world had ever done before, a snowboard descent of the north face of Mount Everest. He reached the top of the world with legendary expedition organizer and outfitter Russell Bryce. He climbed up to the summit with his snowboard strapped to his back. And then, right from the top, he dropped into the famous Norton Couloir, and he carved his way into history. The first snowboard descent of Mount Everest, albeit with an asterisk because he did remove his snowboard in a couple of small sections that was purely rock. After the descent, Marco went on to explain that they had set up advanced base camp at 6,400 meters. The wind has been blowing for days, he said. The couloir looks like concrete, all ice. And on May 23rd at 6 a.m., he says, I reached the summit. An hour later, I strapped on my board. The first turns came quickly. Tricky sections, a cornice, a traverse on the north face, a diagonal couloir, steep and exposed. Then a rock band, a big bowl. Everything was hard, icy like concrete. That was my descent. And imagine the surprise of the climbers who were moving their way agonizingly, slowly up the fixed ropes at the bottom as Marco descended, carving turns right beside them. They must have been absolutely blown away when he came by, probably smiling that typical Marco smile that people who knew him came to love. That was a ride that nobody had ever attempted before. And what he went on to say was, the mountain puts you back in your place fast. That's the good thing. No cheating, he said. When you come close to the edge, it chills you to the bone and you realize you're not much. It's clear. The mountain puts you back where you belong, and that's not such a bad thing. Marco came to love that feeling of clarity when he had to focus everything on that next turn. And even after his descent, he focused on something even bigger, more daring, the Hornbein Couloir. The Hornbein Couloir, a narrow, steep gash on Everest's north face, one of the most legendary routes in mountaineering, named for American climber Tom Hornbein, who climbed it in 1963 up until 2002. Only 12 people in total had made it up the Hornbein Couloir, and it remains one of Everest's crown jewels. And certainly nobody had ever skied or snowboarded down the Hornbein Couloir. It was the Holy Grail. For Marco, this was a dream that kept him awake at night, planning, plotting, determining just what it would take for him to get down the Hornbein Couloir successfully. And it was a line that brought him back to Mount Everest just 1 year later, and there he was, in September, standing again at the summit of Mount Everest with just 2 Sherpas there to assist him. On this expedition, he struggled with illness and exhaustion, but he told friends on his way up, quote, "If I can't ride the Hornbein, I'd rather not descend at all." And there, on September 8th, 2002, just after sunrise, Marco stood once more on the summit of Everest. His Sherpas begged him to reconsider. The couloir was icy, unstable, and the weather was shifting. But Marco was resolute. This was his line. He was going, and it was his destiny.
Hi, Marco! Hey, Papa! Where now? Summit!
The 2 Sherpas watched as he strapped in, and he gave it a final look and then dropped into the abyss.
See you tomorrow.
At first, they weren't worried. They figure that this is such a difficult drop that it's going to take some time for Marco to find his way down through the challenges of the Hornbein Couloir. They watched and saw him, but then after some time, suddenly they realized that there was no trace of him. Marco had disappeared. They searched for any sign, a figure moving, a flash of bright gear, tracks in the snow, and yet there was nothing. And the Sherpas descended, hoping that perhaps he was already down where they would find him. But there were no tracks, no snowboard, no gear, no Marco. Just silence. In Chamonix, Marco was known as the Blonde Angel, and like an angel, he seemed to vanish into the clouds with no body, no trace. His family and friends were left only with sadness and questions. Some even clung to the idea that perhaps Marco had descended and was living in Tibet amongst the yak herders. Of course, there's no evidence of that, but the myth tells you everything about Marco's light. It was too much for his family to accept that this young man had actually disappeared and was no longer. How could they bear to imagine that his flame had been extinguished? And yet today, more than 2 decades later, the Hornbein Couloir has yet to be descended on skis or snowboard. And right now, during the recording of this video, legendary mountaineer and skier Jim Morrison is there to attempt the ski descent of the Hornbein Couloir with the National Geographic team. And very interesting, this is their 3rd return to the mountain to attempt the descent of the Hornbein Couloir. Certainly, this is an expedition that is costing well in excess of $1 million, perhaps several $1,000,000. And last fall, in October, this is the team that, as they were descending back down through the Rongbuk Glacier, defeated by the mountain, they came across the remains, the partial remains of Sandy Irvin, his boot and part of his foot inside that boot. An absolutely amazing change of events for a team that was leaving the mountains with their head down and defeated, at least back then. Now they return. Will they make the first descent of the Hornbein Couloir? And one has to ask, will they be taking a look around for more of the remains or artifacts of the great Sandy Irvin, who disappeared in 1924 with his partner George Mallory? Certainly all eyes will be on the mountain as Jim Morrison attempts what many believe is the impossible. The book about Marco's life, See You Tomorrow, calls Marco a shooting star, bright, brilliant, gone too soon. And the truth is, Marco didn't have a death wish. He had a life wish. In just 23 years, he lived more fully, more authentically than most people do in an entire lifetime. He resisted compromise. He refused to sell out. He followed his calling no matter the cost. And that's what makes Marco unforgettable. Marco's life reminds us that it's not how long we live, but how meaningfully we live. For some, the summit is the finish line, but for others, like Marco, the dream begins where others stop. He was a shooting star gone in a flash, brilliant enough to leave a trail that still inspires many. And now as Jim Morrison prepares to ski the Hornbein Couloir, Marco's story feels more alive than ever. Because every attempt, every dreamer who decides to attempt the Hornbein Couloir carries Marco Siffredi's legacy forward. What do you think? Be sure to leave a comment in the section below. And if you've enjoyed this video, I hope you'll take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. And also check out the members section by clicking the join button. There is a ton of exclusive content there, or you can find me where there's free exclusive content as well on patreon.com/Everest Mystery. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Do a good deed. Don't ask for anything in return. Make the world a better place, one tiny step at a time. Peace be with you.